Something just happened in Formula One that could change the entire 2026 season. Mercedes dominated the very first race of the new era. A 1-2 finish in Australia. Pole position. Race victory. Total control. But the result itself is not what has the paddock on edge. The real story started after the race ended. Because both Ferrari and Red Bull suddenly began saying the same thing. Mercedes might have discovered a massive advantage inside the new engine regulations. Charles Leclerc admitted Ferrari was nowhere near Mercedes in Australia. And some analysts now believe the Mercedes power unit could be producing around 30 extra horsepower compared to rival engines. 30 horsepower. In modern Formula One, that kind of difference can decide an entire championship. Now the situation is escalating. Because Red Bull has dropped what many in the paddock are calling a major technical bombshell about how Mercedes may be exploiting the new hybrid rules. And the FIA is already taking a closer look. Not because Mercedes has been accused of breaking the rules, but because when a team suddenly appears this dominant at the start of a new regulation era, the governing body always investigates the details. Especially when rival teams start asking questions. So now the entire paddock is wondering the same thing. Did Mercedes simply build the best car of the new era? Or did they discover something hidden inside the regulations that nobody else saw coming? Because if the answer is the second one, the controversy that started after the Australian Grand Prix could become the biggest technical battle of the entire 2026 season. The tension inside the paddock did not start when the checkered flag fell in Melbourne. It started a few hours later, when engineers began looking at the numbers. Because when the telemetry from the Australian Grand Prix was analyzed, one detail became impossible to ignore. The Mercedes looked extremely strong on the straights. Not just slightly faster. Significantly faster. And that immediately raised a very uncomfortable question inside several garages. Where exactly is that performance coming from? Ferrari was one of the first teams to openly acknowledge the gap. Charles Leclerc spoke very clearly after qualifying. He admitted that Ferrari was simply nowhere near the pace of Mercedes in Australia. Even if Ferrari had executed the perfect lap, he believed the difference would still be large. According to Leclerc, the most likely explanation was the engine. He said Mercedes had clearly found a huge amount of performance in the power unit compared with everyone else. That statement alone was enough to ignite speculation across the paddock. Because in a brand new engine era like 2026, finding extra performance inside the power unit is the most valuable advantage a team can have. Especially when the regulations limit how often engines can be redesigned. If one manufacturer starts the cycle with a stronger concept, catching up can take years. And that is exactly what worries Mercedes rivals. Some analysts inside the paddock now believe the Mercedes power unit could have around 30 extra horsepower compared with some competitors. 30 horsepower might not sound enormous to casual fans. But in Formula One, it is massive. It can mean better acceleration out of corners, higher top speed on the straights, and more flexibility when deploying electrical energy from the hybrid system. Which is exactly what observers noticed during the race in Australia. The Mercedes cars looked extremely efficient when delivering power out of slow corners. And that efficiency often translated into stronger acceleration down the straights. Red Bull noticed it as well. Max Verstappen did not accuse Mercedes of breaking the rules. But he admitted something that surprised many fans. He said Red Bull simply was not the fastest team in Australia. And if they want to fight for victories in this new era, they will need to find much more performance. For a team that dominated large parts of the previous era, that admission carries a lot of weight. Because Red Bull rarely accepts being behind without raising serious questions. Inside the paddock, several engineers are now discussing a possible explanation. A very clever interpretation of the 2026 hybrid regulations. Some believe Mercedes may have found a way to optimize the relationship between the combustion engine and the electrical deployment system. Others believe the key may lie in combustion efficiency. If Mercedes has discovered a more efficient way to burn the new sustainable fuels, the result could be more usable energy throughout the lap, which would directly translate into stronger hybrid deployment. None of these theories have been confirmed. And it is important to remember that innovation is part of Formula One. Finding clever solutions inside the rules is exactly what engineers are paid to do. But when a team suddenly appears with a very large advantage, the governing body always takes a closer look. That is why the FIA has started monitoring the situation carefully. Not because there is proof of any rule violation. At least not publicly. But because Formula One history shows that the beginning of a new regulation era is often when teams discover unexpected loopholes. And if those loopholes give one team too big an advantage, the FIA sometimes intervenes with technical clarifications. For Mercedes, the situation now becomes both exciting and dangerous. Exciting because they may have built the strongest package of the new era. But dangerous because success always attracts attention. And attention often leads to investigation. The next few races will be extremely important. If Mercedes continues to dominate in the same way they did in Australia, the pressure from rival teams will only increase. More questions. More technical meetings. More scrutiny from the FIA. Because Ferrari and Red Bull are already making one thing clear. Right now, they believe Mercedes has discovered something special inside the new regulations. Something that gives the W17 a serious advantage. And if that advantage continues, the battle behind the scenes may become just as intense as the one happening on track. But the story did not stop with the race result in Melbourne. Because after the data from the Australian Grand Prix began circulating inside the paddock, another detail started to worry rival teams even more. It was not just the raw speed of the Mercedes. It was how efficiently that speed was delivered. Several engineers studying the telemetry noticed that the Mercedes cars were not simply faster in a straight line. They were also extremely efficient when deploying electrical energy. Every time Russell or Antonelli exited a corner, the power delivery looked incredibly smooth. No sudden spikes. No drop in deployment. Just a clean and controlled release of hybrid power. And in the 2026 era, that kind of efficiency can make a huge difference. Because the new regulations rely much more heavily on electrical deployment than previous generations. The hybrid system now contributes a much larger portion of the total power output. Which means the way a team manages the relationship between the combustion engine and the electrical system has become one of the most important technical secrets in Formula One. This is exactly why several rival engineers believe the Mercedes advantage may not come from one single component. Instead, it may come from the integration of the entire power unit system. Combustion efficiency, energy recovery, battery deployment, and the software that controls how all those elements work together. If Mercedes has found a way to optimize that interaction better than anyone else, the advantage could be enormous. And extremely difficult to replicate quickly. Because this kind of performance is not just about building a stronger engine. It is about understanding the entire energy cycle of the car. How energy is harvested, how it is stored, and how it is released during the lap. Some analysts believe Mercedes may have spent years developing extremely advanced simulation models for exactly this purpose. Models that allow engineers to predict how the power unit behaves under different conditions, and then adjust the deployment strategy with incredible precision. If that theory is correct, it would explain why the Mercedes cars looked so stable during the race in Australia. The drivers never seemed to struggle with battery management. They never appeared to run out of electrical deployment at critical moments. And that level of consistency is extremely valuable in modern Formula One. But it also raises another question. If Mercedes truly understands the new hybrid system better than everyone else, then what we saw in Australia might only be the beginning. Because teams usually improve their understanding of a new regulation set over time. And if Mercedes already started with an advantage, that advantage could grow even larger as the season progresses. Which is exactly why the FIA is paying such close attention right now. Whenever a team appears to have discovered a particularly powerful interpretation of the rules, the governing body always reviews the situation carefully. Not because innovation is forbidden, but because the FIA must ensure that the regulations are being applied exactly as intended. Sometimes those reviews confirm that everything is perfectly legal. Sometimes they lead to technical clarifications. And occasionally they result in new directives that limit certain interpretations of the rules. Right now, it is far too early to know which direction the situation will take. But one thing is already clear after the Australian Grand Prix. Mercedes has started the 2026 season with a serious advantage. Ferrari knows it. Red Bull knows it. And the entire paddock is now trying to understand exactly how that advantage was created. Because in Formula One, when one team unlocks a breakthrough at the beginning of a new era, the rest of the grid will do everything possible to catch up, or find a way to stop it. But the situation became even more explosive when the reaction from Red Bull started spreading through the paddock. Because Red Bull did not simply admit that Mercedes was faster. They hinted that something deeper might be happening. Something hidden inside the new regulations. Inside the Red Bull garage, engineers began studying the performance data from Melbourne very carefully. Acceleration traces, hybrid deployment patterns, energy recovery cycles. And what they noticed immediately was how consistently the Mercedes cars delivered power out of corners. The W17 did not just look fast in a straight line. It looked incredibly efficient. Almost like the engine and the electrical system were perfectly synchronized every time the driver pressed the throttle. That detail may sound small, But in the 2026 era, it can be the difference between winning races and struggling in the midfield. Because the new power units rely heavily on the balance between combustion power and electrical deployment. If that balance is even slightly better on one car, the performance gain can become enormous over an entire lap. And that is why some engineers inside Red Bull believe Mercedes may have discovered a very clever interpretation of the hybrid rules. A way to maximize how electrical energy is released during the lap. Possibly through software strategies. Possibly through combustion efficiency. Or possibly through a combination of both. None of these theories have been confirmed. But the fact that they are being discussed at all shows how seriously rival teams are taking the Mercedes performance. And in Formula One, when multiple teams begin questioning the same technical area at the same time, the governing body always pays attention. That is exactly what the FIA is doing now. Behind the scenes, technical delegates are reviewing the performance data from the Australian Grand Prix. They are studying how the Mercedes power unit behaves compared with its rivals. Looking at energy deployment curves, combustion efficiency patterns, and the interaction between the engine and the hybrid system. Not because there is proof of any illegal device. At least none that has been made public. But because the FIA must ensure that every team is operating within the exact limits of the regulations. Sometimes these reviews confirm that everything is perfectly legal, and the team simply found a smarter solution. Other times they reveal gray areas in the rulebook. Interpretations that technically follow the rules but go beyond what the FIA originally intended. When that happens, the governing body may introduce technical clarifications. Small adjustments to prevent teams from exploiting those interpretations further. For Mercedes, this situation creates a fascinating challenge. On one side, the team has delivered a near-perfect start to the season. Pole position, race victory, and a dominant 1-2 finish. George Russell himself sounded thrilled on the radio when he crossed the finish line. He joked about how much he liked the car, and especially how much he liked the engine. A comment that immediately caught attention across the paddock. Because when drivers start praising the power unit that enthusiastically, rival teams start listening very carefully. At the same time, Mercedes leadership knows how Formula One works. Success always attracts scrutiny. Especially when it arrives so suddenly at the start of a new regulation era. If the team continues to dominate in the next races, the pressure from rivals will only grow stronger.